Sudan's ruling generals and the main pro-democracy group have signed a deal that will pave way for elections. Some of the key dissenting political forces have stayed out of the deal. Those that have agreed to the deal will now decide on the role of transitional Prime Minister for 2 years. Joining us is Kholood Khair, founder and director of Confluence Advisory. Kholood, I appreciate your time this afternoon. Now, not all the parties that are involved in this have agreed to the signing of the deal.
No, it's a minority deal. There are key constituents that are out of this, including the bulk of the pro-democracy movement, which is represented through neighborhood resistance committees, and they've been the backbone of the protest movement that had first unseated Bashir and then kept the momentum of protest after the coup. The Islamists also don't feature, and nor do some key Darfuri rebel groups who signed a peace deal with the previous government of Prime Minister Hamdok. And so there are three sort of key constituent blocks that will need to be either included or at the very least brought on board on some level for this agreement to have any chance of being implemented. But as it is, it's quite a wish list and quite an unimplementable agreement.
Well, let's talk about the three main groups that have signed and potentially their differences with those that are not party to the deal.
Yeah, so, there's opposition to this deal from different quarters and for different reasons, spanning the entirety of the Sudanese political landscape. The resistance committees see this as just a way to effectively codify last year's coup and to give the generals not only an out from the burden of governing a country which has been destroyed through their coup, both politically and economically, but it also gives them a hold over power. It legitimizes some of their power. The Islamists are mostly worried and concerned that they will lose their economic aspects and their economic interests, and their economic stranglehold over the economy. They're also concerned that they were not involved in the negotiation process. For the rebel groups who signed the peace deal in 2020 and then backed last year's coup, they feel they have been sidelined by the generals that they supported throughout the coup and its aftermath. So very different reasons for opposition. The one that sort of rings the truest is, of course, from the pro-democracy movement, that this is not what people strove and died for over the past 3 years. It is, in fact, a deal that's going to be very difficult to implement, and it puts inordinate amount of pressure on the civilians that signed it to prove its value.
Now, Sudan's transition of democracy has been somewhat of a minefield, hasn't it? What are some of the hurdles? Well,
there's very, big stumbling blocks. The first one is the level of violence that is currently across the country, both in the conflict zones, which have had sort of protracted conflicts like Darfur, like Blue Nile, like South Kordofan, and parts of the east, but also political violence that has definitely seen an uptick since last year's coup, particularly in the center, where we have had several protesters killed, disappeared, violence meted out against them, sham trials, sort of abusing the legal system in order to put pressure on the protest movement. We also see economic pressures. International aid that was meant to come in during the transitional period under Prime Minister Hamdok failed to come in a timely manner, and that really put pressure on the civilian government at the time to show that it could govern. And of course, now, since last year's coup, all sorts of funding has been stopped by the international bilateral and multilateral organizations, and we have seen a contraction of the economy. We have seen a trade balance, a terrible trade balance. We have seen inflation in 3 digits. And so the general sort of cost of living crisis that I think we see worldwide is heightened in Sudan by the aftermath of the coup. And those are sort of the two biggest stumbling blocks.
Now, you've talked about international aid agencies, etc., that have pulled out and are no longer supporting. Would they recognize this deal?
They have recognized this deal. In many ways, they have midwifed this deal. This deal seems to gain a lot more traction with the international community, and we have seen this through the statements by the international community members, both during the signing ceremony and thereafter. Much more traction with them than it does with domestic audiences. The response from the majority of the Sudanese people is either vehement opposition to this deal or general apathy. I think there's a sense amongst a lot of people that we've seen this film before. before, and it has never really ended well. The international community have said that once a sort of a comprehensive deal is signed, and bearing in mind this is just phase one of a two-phase process, they would be wanting to turn the taps back on, so to speak. But as yet, though they support this deal, there's no sign that any financial commitments have been made.
But what does a perfect deal look like? I mean, are we ever going to get a deal where all sides are entirely happy, or is it a give and take of sorts?
No, this is not, I think, a struggle for perfection. I think, though a perfect deal does not exist, a sort of a better deal than this one might. And it's mostly the process that got us to this deal that had many problems. It was a very opaque process, it was a very exclusionary process, and that's why a lot of people don't feel they can own this deal and sort of buy into it. And that cripples phase two, which is really the more important phase, which is meant to discuss the issues that go to the heart of Sudan's transition, which are security sector reform, transitional justice, financial accountability, and what to do about this Juba peace agreement. And that all of those discussions around all of those, sorting out all of those, solutions for all of those four key issues is meant to only take a month under the current plans, which is, woefully ambitious, I would say, after which is meant to be the final deal. And getting support for that final deal has been hamstrung by the way that this initial deal has been negotiated and signed. So I think there's no point in letting perfect be the enemy of good, but I think we should definitely strive for better.
Now, I'm going to read something from the Sudan's Grassroots Pro-Democracy Network, which is the resistance committee, one of the groups that has not signed and is not happy with this deal. And they've said the Sudanese police have continuously failed to comprehend and fulfill their role as a civilian force established to protect the people, or rather continues to behave as a brutal militia. Now, with a statement like that, do you feel that there is potential for any common ground at all?
I mean, right now, tensions are very high. Members of the resistance committees that I've spoken to speak about a betrayal. They speak about irreparable damage to the trust between the resistance committees and other pro-democracy actors, such as the FFC, that signed this deal. They speak about this being effectively political suicide of the FFC. So, their tensions are high, and there have been a lot of I think there's a sense of dejection, there's a sense of betrayal that's going to be very difficult to overcome. I think, however, there are sort of small glimmers where this trust and this bond between the pro-democracy actors could be salvaged. But that requires those who signed the deal to reach out much more sort of intentionally than they have been. And it requires the negotiation process in the next phase to be far more transparent and far more inclusive. And frankly, it's going to take a lot longer than a month to get any level of consensus over this sort of coming phase two. But it does exist a small window, and I think it behooves the FFC, the Forces for Freedom and Change, who signed this agreement on behalf of the pro-democracy movement, to do that work. Effectively, the hard work starts now. In many ways, this deal was the easy part. Now they really need to sort of focus on building trust with the rest of the street, if that's possible.
Now, the transitional judiciary system is one of those thornier issues that has not been discussed. Is this a deliberate omission to protect the generals in many ways?
Absolutely. The judicial system right now, the entirety of the legal system right now, exists entirely to back up the regime and back up the military system that Sudan has been under pretty much since independence. How we see this playing out today, for example, is that as we speak, there are young people, some children as well, who are undergoing sham trials for the murders of for the alleged murders of the some security actors. Those children are undergoing torture, and bearing in mind also that Sudan signed the United Nations Child Convention Against Torture in 2021. We see the legal system sort of allow for these kinds of miscarriages of justice and allow for these sorts of abuses to take place. And this is part of sort of broader mosaic of mistrust between, the citizens of Sudan and those who mean to govern them. And it's judicial reform, which is also part of this deal, that needs to be much more fleshed out and much more sort of more inclusively discussed in the coming phase.
Kholood Khair, founder and director of Confluence Advisory, speaking to us from London, giving us her analysis on the Sudanese generals and pro-democracy groups signing that framework deal. Appreciate your time.